In Adams County, Mississippi, there was once a stretch of night so feared that even slave catchers began refusing to ride through it alone. Not because of wolves, not because of the swamp, and not because of ghosts, but because men who hunted enslaved people for money started disappearing into that darkness, one by one. At first, plantation owners called it rumor. Then they called it bad luck. Then they called in more dogs, more guns, more men. It did not help, because what moved through those woods was patient, silent, and very human. His name on the plantation ledger was Samuel, but that was not his name. His name was Kofi. Before Mississippi, before the auction block, before the whip, he had been a boy in Yoruba land, 17 years old when the slavers came, 17 when the world he knew was cut apart. The village, his mother's voice, his father's hands correcting his stance, again and again, until movement became instinct. Because Kofi had not been raised as an ordinary boy. He had been raised inside a warrior tradition, not for glory, not for stories, but for survival. He was taught how to move quietly through brush without disturbing the ground, how to wait without sleeping, how to read where another man's attention ended and where his weakness began. His father used to tell him something Kofi would remember long after everything else was taken. Strength matters, speed matters, but patience matters more. Then came the raid, then the march, then the ship, then America. By the time Kofi reached Mississippi, he had lost almost everything a person can lose without dying. His language was no longer safe to speak. His real name had no place in the mouth of the men who bought him. At Dunmore Plantation, they called him Samuel, and for 11 years, he answered to it. Not because he accepted it, but because survival has its own grammar. Dunmore sat 12 miles east of Natchez, on rich cotton land that made white men wealthy and black bodies disposable. More than 200 enslaved people lived and labored there. The owner, Preston Dunmore, rarely dirtied his hands with daily cruelty. Men like him almost never had to. That work belonged to overseers, and the worst of them was Garrett Vance. Vance believed discipline should be seen, heard, remembered. He was the kind of man who spoke softly before ordering a beating, the kind of man who smiled when fear did his work for him. For 11 years, Kofi survived under men like that by becoming difficult to notice. He worked. He listened. He revealed nothing. The other enslaved people at Dunmore knew him as quiet, strong, watchful, a man who wasted no movement, a man whose eyes seemed to stay calm even when everything around him did not. But calm is not the same as empty, and silence is not the same as surrender. By 1838, Kofi was 28 years old. His body carried the damage of Mississippi, scars across his back, 2 missing fingers on his left hand. The deep exhaustion of years spent bending over cotton rows under a sun that did not care whether a man lived or died. But the training that had been planted in him as a boy had not disappeared. It had gone underground, buried deep, waiting. He still felt it sometimes, in the way he placed his feet without thinking, in the way he measured distance at a glance, in the way darkness never frightened him the way it frightened other men. Darkness, to Kofi, had never been empty. It was cover. It was space. It was possibility. And in the summer of 1838, after 11 years of forced obedience, something inside him began to change. Not loudly, not all at once. Quietly, like a blade being sharpened where no one could see it. Because on Dunmore Plantation, there was an old man named Joseph, and what Garrett Vance did to Joseph would bring the warrior in Kofi fully back to life. Joseph had been on Dunmore Plantation longer than almost anyone still alive. 23 years. long enough to watch children become field hands, long enough to watch families broken apart at auction, long enough to understand that surviving slavery was not the same as living through it. He was an old man now, his back bent, his hands swollen, his breathing uneven even on mild days. But in the quarters, Joseph still carried something rare: respect. Not the kind the plantation ever gave, the kind earned quietly, over years, by staying human in a place built to grind humanity down. When tempers rose, Joseph calmed them. When grief spread through the cabins after a sale, Joseph sat beside the grieving and said very little, but enough. And when younger men felt anger rising too hot inside them, Joseph was often the one who reminded them that surviving another day was, by itself, an act of defiance. Garrett Vance hated men like Joseph, not because Joseph was dangerous in any obvious way, but because he was steady. And steady people create loyalty. Loyalty creates community. And community, in a place like Dunmore, was always seen as a threat. In the winter of 1837, Vance began calling it a discipline problem. Cotton baskets not filled fast enough, tools misplaced, work songs falling silent the moment he rode past. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that happen wherever exhausted human beings are being pushed beyond endurance. But Vance saw conspiracy in everything, or perhaps he wanted to, because calling ordinary exhaustion rebellion gave him permission to escalate cruelty, and escalate he did. He began selecting people for punishment not because of what they had done, but because of what their suffering would communicate to everyone else. Older workers, trusted workers, men and women the quarters listened to. Joseph became one of those targets. The first beating came after Vance accused him of slowing the row. Joseph could barely straighten his spine that day, but Vance ordered him tied anyway. The crack of the whip carried across the fields. Everyone heard it. No one turned their head. On plantations, people learned early that even witnessing too openly could become its own offense. Kofi kept picking cotton. That was what survival required. Hands moving, eyes lowered, jaw locked so tightly it hurt. The second beating came less than 3 weeks later. This time the accusation was insolence. Joseph had answered too slowly, or too softly, or not in the tone Vance wanted. The exact reason changed depending on who told it afterward. That was the nature of plantation punishment. The charge almost never mattered. Only the example did. By then, Joseph was already moving like a man whose body no longer trusted mourning. He limped. He coughed at night. He struggled to finish meals. Still, Vance chose him again. Not because Joseph posed any real challenge, but because the old man was loved, and punishing a loved man in public was one of the fastest ways to spread fear. The third beating happened in June. By then, the quarters already knew what Vance was doing. He was not correcting behavior. He was proving ownership. Joseph was accused of stealing time, of stopping too long at the edge of the field to catch his breath. It might have been seconds. It might have been less. Vance had him tied and beaten so severely that some of the women in the quarters began crying before it was over. Joseph did not cry out much. That made it worse. The silence of an old man absorbing that kind of pain, while everyone else stood forced to watch, stayed with people. It stayed with Kofi most of all, because something in Joseph's stillness, even under the lash, felt familiar. A kind of endurance deeper than fear, a refusal to surrender the inside of oneself, even when the body had already been overpowered. Joseph never truly recovered. For 2 weeks, he could not work. For 2 weeks, he lay on a pallet in the quarters, sweating through fever, drifting in and out, speaking only in fragments. People brought him water, soup when they could find enough to spare. a cool rag for his forehead. No doctor came. Men like Preston Dunmore counted output, not suffering. Joseph died on a Sunday in June. The plantation ledger would later record fever. The quarters knew better. Joseph had been beaten into the grave. That evening, they buried him in the small patch of ground where Dunmore's dead were put back into the earth, with no marker grand enough to trouble white memory. The prayer was short. The light was fading. The air smelled of wet soil and summer leaves. Kofi stood near the back, silent. He did not weep. He did not bow his head. He only watched the dirt fall, one handful at a time, onto the man who had carried the weight of that place longer than anyone should have had to carry it. And those who noticed him that evening would remember later that something about Kofi looked different. Not louder, not wild, not reckless. Still, too still, like a man who had reached the end of waiting. For 3 weeks after Joseph's burial, Kofi changed in ways no overseer could read. Outwardly, nothing. He worked the same rows, answered to the name Samuel, moved with the same lowered gaze that 11 years of survival had trained into him. But inside, the old architecture was waking up. At night, when others slept, he let his body remember how to shift weight without sound, how to breathe low and steady, how to hold still without becoming dull. He studied the edges of Dunmore, the fence gaps, the tree lines, the routes used by patrol riders and slave catchers. He listened to whistles in the distance and began sorting them in his mind, signal by signal, pattern by pattern. The Mississippi night was teaching him again. Or perhaps it was simply giving back what had always belonged to him. By the end of those 3 weeks, Kofi was no longer merely surviving Dunmore Plantation. He was preparing. And somewhere beyond the fields, men who made their living hunting human beings had no idea that one of the people they thought was broken had started hunting them first. The first time Kofi left the plantation after Joseph's burial, no one noticed. Not the overseers, not the patrol riders, not the men who believed Dunmore was a place from which no one moved without permission. Because Kofi did not run. Running attracts attention. Running creates urgency, and urgency creates mistakes. He left the way someone leaves a place they fully understand, quietly. There was a gap in the outer fence line on the eastern edge of the plantation. It had existed for years. Workers passed near it when hauling tools or repairing drainage ditches. The overseers knew it was there, but they never bothered fixing it, because men with dogs, guns, and horses believed fences were unnecessary. They believed fear was the real fence. That belief would cost them. Kofi slipped through the opening long after midnight. The Mississippi night was thick with humidity and the smell of river mud. Cicadas screamed in the trees. Somewhere far off, a hound barked. Kofi paused just beyond the plantation boundary, not because he was afraid, but because his training had taught him that the moment after leaving safety was the most important moment of all. He listened. Wind, insects, water moving slowly through reeds, nothing else. Then he moved. For 11 years, Kofi had learned the landscape of Adams County the way field workers learn land without trying, where the ground softened after rain, where horses struggled in cypress mud, where bayou water cut silent paths through tall grass, and where slave catchers preferred to ride. They followed the same paths again and again, the fastest ones, the driest ones, predictable ones, because men who believed they were hunters rarely imagined they themselves could become prey. The man Kofi watched that night was named Price. Price worked for Dace Hollowell, the most respected slave catcher in the Natchez district. Hollowell's operation had a reputation plantation owners trusted. Good dogs, reliable riders, men who knew how to track footprints across swamp ground. Price's job every Tuesday night was simple: ride a circuit through nearby plantations, speak to informants, listen for rumors of escape, collect information, then return before dawn. He had ridden that same circuit for years, which meant Kofi already knew his route. He knew where the horse slowed near soft ground. He knew where the trees thickened close to the path. He knew where the man would have to dismount to cross a narrow stretch of marsh. Knowledge like that is power, if a person has patience. And Kofi had learned patience long before he ever saw Mississippi. Price reached the marsh crossing a little after midnight. He swung down from his horse the way he always did, cursing softly as mud swallowed the heel of his boot. The lantern in his hand threw weak yellow light across the reeds. Dogs were not with him tonight. That was normal. This was only a routine circuit. No fugitives reported. No urgency. Just another quiet ride through land he believed he controlled. Price never saw Kofi, not when the first sound came behind him. A faint movement in grass, too soft to alarm a man already irritated with swamp mud. Not when the cord slipped over his throat. Not when the pressure came fast and sudden, pulling him backward into darkness. Everything happened in silence. No gunshot, no scream, no struggle long enough to leave evidence anyone could easily read. By the time the lantern tipped into the mud and went dark, the Mississippi night had already swallowed the moment. Kofi dragged the body into deeper brush where water would rise with the next rain. Then he waited, because warriors are taught something hunters rarely learn. Leaving too quickly is as dangerous as arriving too loudly. So he stayed still, listening again, for riders, for dogs, for anything that suggested the night had changed. But the night remained exactly what it had been before. Insects, wind, water. The world had not noticed. Kofi returned to Dunmore just before dawn, the same way he had left, through the gap in the fence, across the quiet yard, into the quarters before the first rooster called. When the sun rose, he stood in the cotton rows with everyone else, hands moving, head lowered. Samuel, the obedient field hand. Garrett Vance rode past on horseback that morning. His eyes scanned the workers the way overseers always did, looking for weakness, looking for resistance, looking for anything out of place. He looked directly at Kofi and saw exactly what he expected to see: a man who had accepted his place. Later that afternoon, news began moving across Adams County. A farmer had found Hollowell's rider, found him in the marsh grass where the ground swallowed sound. The farmer would later tell the sheriff something strange. He said the scene did not look like an animal attack, and it did not look like an accident. It looked intentional. But there were no footprints clear enough to follow, no witnesses, no explanation. Only a dead slave catcher and a silence the investigation could not break. 3 weeks later, another man disappeared. 2 weeks after that, another. And somewhere inside the quarters at Dunmore Plantation, Kofi continued waking before sunrise, walking to the cotton fields, and waiting. Because the Mississippi night had finally become what it had always been meant to be for him: cover, patience, and a hunting ground the slave catchers would soon learn to fear. By the end of 1838, 5 slave catchers had disappeared. Not in the same place, not in the same way, but always at night, always without witnesses, always leaving behind the same unsettling absence of explanation. Men who had spent years hunting fugitives across the Mississippi countryside were suddenly vanishing from the very roads they knew best. And for the first time in Adams County, slave catchers began riding differently. They stopped traveling alone. They moved in pairs, sometimes in groups of 3. Lanterns burned brighter. Guns stayed in hand. Dogs were brought even on routine rides. But fear changes how men think. and fear had begun to creep into the slave-catching business. Dace Hollowell felt it more than anyone. His reputation had been built on reliability. Planters trusted him because he found runaways, because his dogs tracked well, because his men knew the country. But now, 5 of his riders were gone. Each disappearance meant lost money, lost confidence, lost control. Hollowell refused to admit fear openly. Men like him rarely did. But the changes in his operation said everything. No more solo circuits, no more casual patrols, and no more night rides unless absolutely necessary. To the plantation owners, this was unacceptable. Slave catching was not just a job, it was the backbone of control. Without it, escape became possible. And once escape became possible, the entire system began to tremble. Meetings were held in Natchez. Planters gathered in candlelit rooms, speaking in lowered voices about a problem none of them wanted to name directly. Something was happening in Adams County, something deliberate. But acknowledging that possibility required believing something even more troubling, that an enslaved man, somewhere among the thousands they believed broken, was hunting them, and doing it well. Most refused to believe that. Instead, they blamed accidents, whiskey, rivalries between catchers, anything that preserved the illusion of control. But the disappearances continued. Kofi watched all of it, every change, every new patrol pattern, every adjustment in how the catchers moved through the land. He studied them the same way his father had once taught him to study opponents before battle, how long they rode before resting, where they slowed their horses, where their attention drifted. Men who feel safe move differently than men who feel hunted. They rush, they cluster, they speak louder than they realize, and in the darkness, sound travels. The whistles were the most useful. Slave catchers used them constantly, short bursts to signal direction, long notes to call the dogs, patterns that told riders where the others were moving through the night. Efficient, practical, and to someone listening carefully, incredibly revealing. Each whistle mapped a man's position in the darkness. Each echo revealed distance. To Kofi, it was like listening to a battlefield signal system, a language of movement, a language his training had prepared him to read. The third disappearance changed everything, because the man who vanished that night had not been alone. 2 riders had entered the woods together. Only one came out. He reached Natchez just before dawn, shaking, pale, barely able to finish sentences. He told the sheriff something strange. He said he never saw the attacker, not clearly, only movement, a shape in the trees, then silence, then his partner gone. The sheriff wrote the statement down carefully, but he did not believe it. Men preferred explanations they could see. Ghosts in the woods did not fit the world they thought they understood. By the middle of 1839, the slave-catching business in Adams County was in crisis. Some men left the region entirely. They took their dogs, their rifles, their contracts, and moved west into Louisiana, where the nights felt safer. Those who stayed raised their prices. Higher pay for more dangerous work. Planters complained, but they paid, because the alternative was worse. Every month that passed without reliable slave catching meant more runaways reaching freedom, more empty spaces in plantation ledgers, more proof that the system could fail. In the fall of that year, the largest planters in the district gathered again in Natchez. This time they decided to bring in specialists, 2 professional hunters from New Orleans, men with reputations for solving problems local forces could not handle. Their names were Prout and Sable. They arrived with confidence, men like them always did. They interviewed slave catchers, examined reports, studied the disappearance sites. After 2 weeks, they presented their conclusion. According to them, the attacks were the work of a small, organized group of enslaved men hiding in the bayou country east of Natchez. Their plan was simple: conduct a massive sweep. Dogs, armed riders, search the swamps until the group was found and destroyed. The plan sounded convincing. The planters approved it immediately. What none of them realized was that the man they were hunting was not hiding in the bayou at all. He was sleeping each night in the quarters of Dunmore Plantation, waking every morning to pick cotton under Garrett Vance's supervision, listening quietly as news of the coming sweep traveled through the enslaved grapevine, and adjusting his plans accordingly. Because Kofi understood something the hunters did not. The moment Prout and Sable arrived, the hunt had changed. And when the hunt changes, a true warrior does not wait for the enemy to strike first. He chooses the battlefield. He chooses the moment. And then, he removes the most dangerous men on the board before the game even begins. Kofi spent 5 days watching them. Prout and Sable moved carefully, more carefully than the local slave catchers ever had. They carried themselves like men who had survived dangerous work before. They did not ride alone. They checked their surroundings. They kept their pistols close. But experience can create its own blind spots, because men who believe they understand danger often assume they know where it will come from, and where it will not. For 5 days, Kofi studied their habits, where they stayed in Natchez, what roads they preferred, when they separated from the larger patrol groups, when their attention relaxed, even slightly. He followed at a distance, never close enough to be seen, never close enough to disturb the pattern of their days, just watching, just learning. Because patience, his father had always said, wins battles before they begin. On the 6th night, Prout and Sable rode out together. Their destination was a plantation east of Natchez where rumors of escape had reached them. The road cut through a stretch of woodland thick with oak and cypress. Moonlight barely reached the ground beneath the branches, the kind of darkness most men hurry through. But Kofi had never feared darkness. Darkness had protected him long before Mississippi. The two hunters slowed their horses as the road narrowed. They spoke quietly to each other, confident, focused, certain they were closing in on their quarry. They believed they were moving toward the source of the disappearances. What they did not know was that the source had been watching them for nearly a week, waiting. The first horse shied suddenly, just a small movement, enough to break the rhythm of the ride. Prout turned his head. That was the moment Kofi had been waiting for. He moved from the trees the way he had been trained to move since childhood. Fast, precise, silent. The cord tightened. The struggle lasted only seconds. Sable tried to draw his pistol, but confusion is the most dangerous weapon in the dark, and confusion ruled those woods that night. By the time the horses stopped thrashing, the Mississippi night had swallowed everything again. No gunshot, no witness, no clear sign of what had happened. Just two of the most feared slave hunters in the Gulf South, gone. And somewhere in the shadows, a man who had carried the patience of a warrior across an ocean. When Prout and Sable failed to return, the planned sweep collapsed almost immediately. Without their leadership, the operation lost direction. Riders searched the bayou country anyway. Dogs combed the swamps. Lanterns moved through the trees for days. They found nothing. Because there had never been a hidden group in the swamps. There had only been one man. Investigators eventually turned their attention to the plantations themselves. They questioned hundreds of enslaved people. They searched records. They studied every man who might have the strength or skill required. At Dunmore Plantation, they questioned Kofi. They asked where he had been during the nights of the disappearances. He answered simply, working, sleeping, living the life expected of him, the same quiet field hand they had always seen. Nothing about him matched the picture in their minds, because the picture in their minds did not include the possibility that a man they considered broken could be the most dangerous person in the county. The investigation ended the way so many investigations do when the truth lies outside the imagination of those conducting it, with guesses, with paperwork, with explanations that satisfied no one. Some blamed accidents, some blamed rivalries among slave catchers, others whispered about spirits in the swamp, but none of them named Kofi. He continued working the fields through the rest of 1839, and something began changing across Adams County. Slave catchers became harder to find. Those who remained demanded higher pay. Many refused night rides altogether, and slowly, quietly, more enslaved people began disappearing in the opposite direction, toward freedom. What happened to Kofi after 1840 is something history never recorded clearly. Some accounts say he escaped north. Some say he crossed into Mexico, where slavery had already been abolished. Others say he vanished into the Mississippi wilderness, the same way his enemies had vanished before him. But one thing is certain: he was never returned to Dunmore Plantation. His name disappears from the plantation ledger in 1841. No record of capture, no record of sale, no punishment entry, just absence. The men who spent 2 years searching for the shadow in the Mississippi night never realized they had already looked him in the eyes. They had questioned him, watched him work, dismissed him as nothing, because systems built on arrogance often fail to recognize the people capable of destroying them. His name was not Samuel. It was Kofi, a name given to a boy born on a Friday in Yoruba land, a name that crossed the Atlantic, survived the auction block, endured 11 years of slavery, and returned, finally, to the Mississippi darkness, where patience became justice, and where the hunters learned that the night was no longer theirs.